Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we're going to talk about Spencer Stuart's Mid-Cap S&P 400 Board Report. And joining me is a familiar face, Ann Yerger, who's the Senior Advisor with Spencer Stuart's North American Board Practice. She is also a board member of Bed Bath & Beyond and Hershey Entertainment and Resorts, which gives her a in the boardroom perspective. So welcome, Ann.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So obviously we're familiar with Spencer Stuart doing research because it wasn't too long ago that we on this show covered the Spencer Stuart's well-respected annual board index. But that index looks at the S&P 500. And in fact, most of the research that you do see around that, sort of becomes reported on and stuff looks more at the upper crust. So the fact that Spencer Stuart is looking at the mid-cap sector, I think is excellent because that is equally important, to everything that happens in the boardroom. And so I'm anxious to hear sort of what came out of that research. But before we get started on the actual highlights, Anne, could you just recap sort of the report and the study itself?
Sure. Well, TK, as you noted, for 35 years, Spencer Stuart has published the Spencer Stuart Board Index, which analyzes the governance practices of the S&P 500 companies, which are generally the largest companies in the public markets. But we've known for many years that the practices of mid and smaller cap companies are very different from larger companies. So we thought it was time, in fact, probably long overdue for us to study and to provide some insights beyond the S&P 500. So very similar to the board index, we looked at proxy filings and we looked at corporate governance policies of the 400 and used that so 2020 is our base year for that report.
Yeah. And do you have any recollection of when it was done? Because it certainly that sort of impacts how much the pandemic and the year had on the results.
Just like the board index of the S&P 500, all of this was done through proxies filed through June of 2020. So proxies generally were probably in the works, getting published and printed pre-COVID, with board composition and other considerations pre-COVID. So, it'll be interesting to see how things change in 2021.
Yeah, that's going to be so interesting for both reports, I think, because we're going to have that influence.
Right, and not just COVID, but the racial injustice protests, and so much has happened this year, and it's very much influencing what we're seeing in the boardrooms today.
Yeah, I agree. So highlight. So Anne, what from the board report was the most telling highlight when you had a chance to review the results?
So I'm going to couch that by sharing a few of the highlights, and maybe some of them aren't too surprising, but at the highest level, mid-cap boards are generally smaller in size, they're younger, and they're less diverse than larger S&P 500 companies. I'll also note that the profiles of directors joining mid-cap companies very much differ from large caps. Mid-cap boards tend to cast or appear to be casting a wider and deeper net to identify talent. They're appointing far more actively employed executives, first-time directors, and division and functional heads compared to the large cap space. But I think the big highlight is on the diversity front. And if we drill down on the diversity data that came out of the report, mid-cap boards, first of all, appear to be about a year behind the large caps when it comes to gender diversity. So 26% of mid-cap directors are women, which was where large cap boards were last year. 4 mid-cap boards have no women directors, while today every S&P 500 board has at least one female director. Mid-cap boards significantly lag the large caps when it comes to people of color. We did a deeper study of the 100 largest mid-cap boards, and we found that 12% of these directors were racial or ethnic minorities. In comparison, 22% of the directors serving on the S&P 500 boards were minorities. And I'll clarify, that was a sample of 200 of the S&P 500. I'll also note that both percentages fall far short of US demographics, where according to our Census Bureau, 38% of our population is considered a minority. I will say that one similarity is that mid-cap boards, like the large caps, appear to be focusing on board diversity. 58% of the directors joining mid-cap boards last year were either women or minority men. Women represented 48% of the directors added to the mid-cap over the past year, and that's just slightly below what was the percentage appointed to the large cap companies. But only 18% of the 2020 mid-cap director appointments were minorities, compared to 22% of the S&P 500. Roughly 10% of the mid-cap companies in our report expressed or disclosed a commitment to including women and people of color in their director searches. Meanwhile, we saw S&P 500 companies, almost a quarter, 24%, reported having sort of adopted a Rooney Rule or something similar to enhance their searches to include women and people of color.
So it's a little disappointing, because if you think that, to your statistics, that they were going down to division heads and doing that, which is what you would expect probably in mid cap and certainly in small cap, you probably have a higher percentage, because getting people of color into the senior management it seems like a bigger challenge. So you would hope that there would be a wider market to sort of choose from at that division head level or even below. But again, I'm not sure of the explanation, except, like you said, that there is a lag here. The good news is that, I think in all my travels, and I'm sure in yours as well, this is certainly on people's agenda. And there's a high awareness. So again, I'm hoping that because of when this research was taken versus what we're going to see in the 2021 report, I'm hoping that we do see quite a move in all the sectors, of people that are sensitive to this. Because if not, you sort of have to wonder that whether somebody's living under a rock, So let me ask you a question. We do have a little time left. Was there anything else that sort of tweaked you a little bit when you read it about the mid-cap report?
Yeah, and I think an interesting data point is turnover. And this sort of plays into, TK, your observations about enhancing diversity on mid-cap boards. It turns out that turnover is generally the same at both large and mid-cap boards. The directors joining these boards in 2020 represented about 8% of all the directors in each group. I'll also note that the turnover mechanisms differ. Only 57% of the mid-cap boards have a mandatory retirement policy, whereas 70% of the large caps do. And while mid-cap boards are less likely to have a mandatory retirement age, those that do set the age cap at 75 or older. And as I noted earlier, these boards tend to be younger, so there's a very long runway in some cases before there's turnover. So it's going to be really interesting to see if the turnover data changes, or if we see more boards increasing their size to enhance their diversity. We've certainly seen that in the large cap space when it comes to gender diversity, and we will be paying close attention to that this year in this year's report when it comes to both gender and race and ethnic diversity.
Well, I'm going to send out a warning signal, because, when you say that, what was that number for turnover again?
The incoming classes are about 8% of the total number of directors.
So when you look at that, and then you have investors out there looking at the PwC numbers, which show that in their study, 49% of sitting board members feel that there's a member, at least one member on their board that should be replaced, and 22% said two or more. Those are just too far apart in numbers, and it really reflects on what our experience has been in boards not having the tough conversations. We know they're doing the performance reviews. But evidently, that information that comes back from those is not being dealt with in a manner that is showing the level of refreshment that probably should be, on the board. So, that's if something isn't done about that by the companies, I'm reasonably sure in today's environment that something's going to be coming down the pike that will be more mandatory rather than people recognizing the need.
Yeah, and if I can add one point to TK, for me, it's even less about, of course, all boards should be addressing performance issues. That it just seems like table stakes. But I also think boards need to be doing a really good job looking ahead and figuring out what skills and perspectives are needed in the boardroom. So being more future oriented as they're contemplating the board. And sometimes it's less about a director's performance and more about maybe he or she is not the optimal fit given the direction of the company. So I think that those conversations need to happen as well. And I also think expectations that an appointment to a board is, a decades plus role, those need to be reshaped.
Well, and board evaluation shouldn't be just about performance. I agree. It should be about succession planning. And the thing that drives me crazy is that people don't think about who's going to chair the committees when they bring on a new director, and you got to have a supply of people that are qualified to be particularly the head of audit and the head of compensation. So if you see that you have a lacking skill set after whoever's the current chair, I just think that there's not even close to enough planning being done about that type of succession. So
such a good point. Committees they play such an important role, and the committee chairs have a heavy lift. So you're right. Good talent in those roles.
Oh my God! Think about how much they do between meetings these days. It's become, really a position of an enormous amount of time, and dedication to companies that do it right. And I just take my hat off to them because it is a tough assignment.
Agreed.
So there's a lot more in this board report that we've been able to cover quickly. Where can people get a copy of the full report and the results?
Yep, go to spencerstewart.com. And I'm not sure how easy it is to find once you get there, but I think if you search on Mid-Cap, it pulls right up.
Yeah. Well, Anne, as usual, thank you for taking the time, your perspective, both on with your work with the Council of Institutional Investors, which was sort of prepared you for all this, and then subsequently sitting on boards and working with Spencer Stuart gives you a great outlook on what the landscape is out there. So I always appreciate when you take the time to come on. So thanks.
Well, thank you, TK. Talk soon. Take care.
Yep. And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.